Going to start with the afternoon program. The morning was great, and the afternoon will be great too. Our first speaker is Hiroo Ichikawa. He's Dean and Professor at the Graduate School of Governance Studies, Meiji University in Japan, and also the Executive Director of the Mori Memorial Foundation, which is really one of the most important foundations that supports issues that go from art and culture. They have one of the most extraordinary collections of art in Japan and probably in the world, and also to having started, probably due to Ichikawa's sort of ideas and urgings, support this big study that you will hear about, that is an annual study that has kept growing and adds to the standard type of city study and city index a whole variety of dimensions which are unusual in these indexes. It's one of the best. I've served on the board of that project, so it includes inner city neighborhood, different kinds of spaces within the city and different actors. What does the city look like from a corporate type? What does the city look like if you are the citizen of a modest neighborhood? So it is really unlike any of those indexes that are circulating and on which consulting firms often are making a living. You know what I mean, I think, right? Now, I first met Hiroo Ichikawa as a person who brought a whole bunch of American planners. Amanda, what is the... Amanda Burdett, right? Yeah, she was there. I mean, it was just an extraordinary... Jeannie Birch, you know, we all wound up there in Tokyo, and there was Professor Ichikawa telling us what to do and what to see and what to know. It was wonderful. And then, of course, in the Mori Foundation board, he works also in the School of Science and Engineering at Waseda University in Japan, and is, of course, a member of the steering committee and chairman of the Global Power City Index projects. Professor Ichikawa.
So good afternoon. Today, I'd like to explain this topic. What does the Global Power City Index 2013 tell us about what mobility in New York, Tokyo, and other several cities? Usually, we present the newest data of this GPCI in October. So today, I use the data of 2013. Just start about what is a GPCI. You may have a brochure on your hand now. That's committee members, the principal advisor, Sir Peter Hall, and of course Saskia is one of our members. And we chose 40 major cities in the world, just 17 in Europe and Africa, 13 in Asia and Oceania, and other just in North and Latin America. There are three types of category to select these cities. First criteria is very important cities in many other world ranking cities. Second category is major cities in the famous country ranking. The third category is just based on our committee's decision. Structures. There are 6 urban functions: economy, research and development, cultural interaction, livability, environment, and accessibility. Using these, finally, we use the 70 indicators under these 6 functions. Just finally to compare with other cities using these data. And I will explain later more in detail. In case of economy, there are 6 categories such as market size, to the regulations and risks, And each category is composed of 2 or 3 indicators. And finally, 13 indicators are used to evaluate this function of economy. Second one is research and development. There are 3 groups and 8 indicators. Culture interaction. There are 5 groups, and as a total, we have 6 indicators. For livability, there are 5 groups, and 14 indicators are used to evaluate. Environment, 3 groups, and 9 indicators. And accessibility, well, this is the most important topic today. In this function of accessibility, we have 4 groups of indicators, and as a total, 10 indicators are used to evaluate. Well, this is a total ranking by using the analysis of 6 functions. As you can find here, we have a top 4 cities as a first group and other cities. So usually these 4 top cities just keep just the same territories, but other cities are coming up now. Well, you can find here change of top. In 2012, New York was replaced by London, because of Olympic Games in London at that time. And other cities, mainly the major Asian cities, are coming up now, such as Singapore, Seoul, and Hong Kong and Shanghai. This is a case of North American cities. Except Washington, D.C., other cities are just getting down, because now major Asian cities are coming up now. That's a reason. North American cities are losing the positions now. This is data you can find here. In case of economy, Tokyo has a top, R&D, New York has a top, cultural interaction, London has a top, livability, Paris has a top, environment, Tokyo has a top, and accessibility, London has a top. But finally, as a total score, every year, London and New York are very important rivals each other. These are North American cities. Well, except R&D, generally speaking, the North American cities are just now under average, except New York. Okay, accessibility. There are 4 indicator groups. First one is the international transportation network. Second one is infrastructure of international transportation. Third one is transportation service of inner city. And the fourth one is traffic convenience. This is just a comparison between 4 cities about these 4 categories. And blue round shows the weakness, and red round shows the strength. So you can find here, in case of this number of cities with direct international flights, London at the top. While New York has not necessarily good points. Same to the passengers. But the number of runways, while New York has 3 international airports, just the top. These North American cities. Well, already the data shows, except New York, just most cases, that's under average between 40 cities, among 40 cities in the world. Okay, just this more in detail about topic. punctuality of public transportation, convenience of commuting, travel time between inner city areas and international airports, transportation fatalities per population, taxi fares. So what's good for New York, what's good for Tokyo? So you can find the taxi fare, it's worst in the world in Tokyo. Convenience of commuting, New York has a top. North American cities, well, travel time between inner city areas and international airports, Boston has a top. Transportation fatalities per population, just Toronto is best. Toronto is not American city, but in North American cities, the data, and taxi fares. Okay, these are just topic from the data of Global Pulse Index GPCI. And from last year, we are trying to different type of evaluation now. We call that is urban intangible value. Of course, in a GPCI, we use a kind of data which can be calculated as a data. But whenever we see the fascination of cities, some of data cannot be counted, but people can feel this is good or not. So from this kind of idea, we make a new type of evaluation system called urban intangible value. There are three types of characteristics. One is spatial setting. Second one is activities. Third one is spatial management. And of course, different people have a different value, same to the different regions. So there are three types of values there: universal, regional, and cultural, and individual. Finally, we make some matrix between these six elements. And for evaluation, we chose six elements of framework: efficiency, accuracy, and speed, security and safety, diversity, hospitality, metabolism. Then, what happened here? Okay. Well, we have so many kinds of lists, but today I just show some example here. This is a case of accuracy and speed. Travel time from city center to some areas in 10 kilometers. This shows the time. So you can find the worst case of Barcelona, best one is Vienna, and Tokyo and New York just kind of middle. This is efficiency. So we are just counting the fewer traffic jams and congestion of public transportation. So this is a score. So higher is the best. So Seoul has a score of 50s. Tokyo has following that. So New York has a kind of middle. The topic now we are doing is already we started GPCI 2008, and every year we are using evaluation by using 70 indicators which can be measured as a data. And from last year we put one more scheme of this urban intangible value. So in case of transportation system, we can find a similar type of data. So in case of GPCI, we can choose international transport network. And in case of urban intangible value, we can choose flight on time rate. So we can compare. In case of London, both are not bad. In case of Tokyo, international transport network is quite low scores. But versus, in case of this flight on time rate is the best in the world. Well, this kind of new idea of evaluation should be important to find more fascination of cities. So we are still keeping this kind of data analysis. And this October, we will present 2014's GPCI. This kind of idea of urban intangible value will be combined together. This is a different topic. We are doing over city ranking in city area, but whenever people find good points of any cities, it's not only city. This is a data for inner city index. 5 kilometers from the city center and 10 kilometers from city center. Then we compared major cities in the world. And in this GPICI, we call it GPICI, we have 6 properties. And the 6th property is just mobility. And several this kind of indicators we are using. And this GPICI is just done in 2010. This year, 2014, now we are revising. So maybe near soon we will get more data. But in principle, not so different. So today I will present a case of 2010. This is just the data of subway stations in New York and London, Paris and Tokyo. So you can read here, London, New York are not necessarily top cities about this kind of data. In case of Paris and Tokyo, they are just rivals in this data. This is access from city center to airport by using data of train travel time, drive distance, and fares of train, bus, and taxi. So we can find some characteristics. In case of taxi fare, Tokyo is the worst in the world. I don't know why. And this is just airport performance, runways, and cities connections, international flight, and just as a week base. So in this field, every time London has a best score. Okay, just coming to the different topic after this kind of data analysis. I'm not sure you know this new type of train. It's called Maglev train. Already bullet train, high-speed railway is very famous, but already now Japanese technology makes new type of train now. And before coming to this topic, I have to explain what is growth axis in Japan. The Tokyo, Nagoya, Osaka, this is the most important part last 50 years, 60 years. It's called Pacific Belt region. Now it's extended to the Fukuoka. So this is the most important axis for growth in Japan now. And about half of the population of Japan just lives here. And Tokyo had 35 million as a region. Furthermore, from the viewpoint of economic activities and others, already Tokyo has a big territory to the northern part of Japan. And now, just have a chance to include Nagoya. Why it's possible? Answer is this new mobility. Well, this is a Tokaido bullet train from Tokyo to Nagoya to Osaka. And this was constructed in 1964. And we have no troubles in this history, bullet train. But now this is about, the speed is 300 kilometers per hour. But now, Maglev train will be constructed in 2027, just 13 years from now. How it's connected? From Tokyo to Nagoya, just direct. And it is running 500 kilometers per hour. It's never happened in the world. It's a fast history. to connect these two cities. Now it takes 140 minutes. But now, by this new Maglev train, it takes only 40 minutes. So, from the history of a train, every time they are trying to higher speed. It's true, but in this case, from our viewpoint as urban planners, it's a very different topic. What happens here by using this new Maglev train? Okay, this is the accessibility maps. Of course, we have just real maps, but from the viewpoint of time and distance, it's different. So this is 1930, 1964, near future. This is our country. So you can find here, okay, we have Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, Tokyo, Nagoya, Osaka. But now, Nagoya is becoming a suburban city of Tokyo. Tokyo has a more bigger size of metropolitan regions. Now what happened here? Now there are this kind of several cities. They have independent cities and different populations. But in 13 years from now on, Tokyo and Nagoya will be combined together. So now Tokyo had 35 million in the metropolitan region. But after the Maglev train is installed, Nagoya is a part of Tokyo. Finally, Tokyo region has about 5 million. So the important thing here is Nagoya has a very important industry as manufacturing because of Toyota. Tokyo has the third sector industries, business industries. So it's combined together. So as a total, this is the biggest, although it's the biggest in the world, but from the viewpoint of a function of urban city, Nagoya and Tokyo is combined together. It means, finally, as I explained now, as axis of growth of Tokyo to Nagoya to Osaka to Fukuoka, this part is the most important part. So now I'm doing just, city ranking. Once this kind of new type of Maglev train is installed, you have to change the idea. Even if city is distant, function is very close to each other. Finally, you have to think about what is a city, what is a power of a city. That is one answer. It's our expectation so far now. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And I can assure you that creating all these indexes, how long have I been on the board? 5 years?
6 years now.
6 years. Yes, I'm beginning to feel a bit exhausted. Just hearing you talk now, I said, my God, right. But, so are there any questions or comments? Let me ask you then a question. Just picking up on this last point that you made. I mean, one version of a viable, dense, urbanized space is a multipolar space. So yes, you can have a vast population, but you really have multiple nodes. And in some version of let's say a microcosm, London is a perfect model. London has de facto about 19 mini cities. When you take a statistical representation of the density, I'm not talking about visual geo-imaging, representation of Tokyo, of London, it looks like it is extremely flat. I mean, unlike, say, any other major global city that you might take. But when you look at density of workplaces, it is very, very sharp, right, the concentration. So there are ways in which a huge metropolitan area can be, with enormous density, can be handled in ways that still keep it like a humanized space. What do you think of this? Because I know each one of those cities, and they are really different. I cannot imagine what it means to merge them all, and each one of them is already huge. Osaka and Tokyo are simply huge. What are we looking at when we look at that?
Well,
and I couldn't quite tell whether you like the idea or not? You were very Japanese, very...
Oh,
you know?
I'm just Japanese, okay. Well, okay, in the field of urban planning, we studied the best thing is decentralization. And in 1902, Ebenezer Howard proposed Garden City of Tomorrow. Of course, we know. So the central part of the city should be good for the working, and the suburban area is good for the living.
I would not want to live in one of those.
Okay, it's okay. But now it's changing. Already, in case of Japan, in case of Tokyo, in case of New York, some of functions come into city center. In this case, okay, again, it's concentrated and more density happened here. But the point here is, in case of this Maglev train, Nagoya keeps their own domain there. They never move to Tokyo. But as a function of cities, it's combined. It's a new idea. So we never study about this kind of topic in 20th centuries. This new idea about 21st century. Because of technology makes that. This is my understanding. So we have to change idea of the planning, urban planning, metropolitan planning. It should be different for the next stage. This is my understanding now.
Yeah. But do you think that, say, Nagoya can keep its specific identity, or, you know, it's sort of,
Yeah, that's right.
if you want, economic histories that have fed what Nagoya is today?
Yeah, because it takes only 40 minutes. They don't have to move to Tokyo.
Right.
They can keep their own, you know, activities there. But as a total of the metropolitan city or areas,
So then,
their power.
I mean, the big comparison is the mega cities that we know, especially in the global south, which are these endless stretches.
That's right.
Without a shape, without nodal articulation,
Right.
and increasingly degraded as we move to the edges typically. You see this as a kind of alternative format.
Yeah, this time I think it's a new idea
Right.
to keep our domain.
Very good. Yes, you have a question? Please go.
Thanks. As somebody coming from the UK, I was amazed to see that London comes out at the top of this list. London is a place where surveys show that people are more unhappy. There's much higher rates of social inequality, and that the sort of power and influence of London is partly through extracting wealth, income and resources and public expenditure from the world and from the rest of the United Kingdom. So in what way can we think that this is an accurate measure? And in particular, it doesn't take into account one very crucial thing, and that is measures of economic and social and property inequality.
Well, it's kind of idea. Okay, in case of Japan, we have already the starting of decrease of population. So after that, maybe next 20 years, how we can manage our country. So maybe some of part or some of city, some of area should sustain the country. So in such kind of case, of course, some parts are very well, very big, you know, very rich. Some are not. But finally, this rich area makes support some others. So we have to keep, think about such kind of fact. Someone have to earn the money. Where is that? This is one point. Of course, we need, kind of equal, the development and anything. But it's kind of, fact we have to understand that. Especially we are thinking about that because of the point of decrease of population now happened in Japan now.
The question that he was asking, and let me just focus on the one part that you just said, and I was on London, of course, but the one part where rich areas, you say, do actually produce some economic benefits also for the lower income areas. Of course, London has that too, but London, like New York, have also developed extraordinary capabilities to extract from really the world and their own city, right, and concentrate. And I think that the intervening variable is the capacity of the financial sector to financialize just about everything, including student loans, used car loans. It doesn't matter how low. So both in New York and London, It's the financializing machinery that enables that center to really extract probably much more than it gives. Now, I know Tokyo is different. It is really different. But I think maybe you could address the question of how the index shows that London is at the top, right? That's what you were sort of asking, right? That it comes out like, just, you know, can you elaborate just a bit? How would you explain, in terms of the index, what he is saying in terms of facts about London?
Well, this is a kind of data analysis by using 70 indicators. And within such kind of data, we can say something. But of course, we have to think about more about everything. Maybe it should be an answer to you about that. And that's the point we are starting this urban intangible value. This should be a different scheme to find the more,
That's right.
value of the city.
We have added the intangible, and so that one begins to measure all kinds of other items in this, right? All right, next, yes.
Hi, I have two very quick questions. The maps, the slide before this, I love the conceptual geographies, and you show how that changed, and even here. My question is, what's the implication on governance? When you try to agglomerate 50 million people within a 60-minute radius, what implication would that have on governance? That's the first question. Secondly, we know that all the investment that Asian cities are doing in transit, inner city transit, and America is not. They're only managing to build one subway line in New York, which is the best city in this country, in the past 70 years. How do you, now, I see that you're emphasizing how this would impact accessibility, but I would question, because in the past 100 years, New York hasn't really invested so much in accessibility. It still manages to do fine, and there's really no future for bullet trains, maglev trains in America for a really long time to come. So do you really think the gap is going to widen, or will there be other factors that'll start pulling in and balance it out?
Well, I just come back to this Japan's growth poll here. And it's related to this topic. First question of yours is just how to govern the city and areas. It's a different topic. Even this kind of shape happened here. You have a different administrative boundary, different government. They never combine. Discussions about never happened. So it's okay. But as actual activities, we can find different new type of system of growth now. So, because after that, how we can accept this kind of fact? So maybe your second question related to such kind of thing. Well, actually, this is happening already, and because of change of sharing industry in the world now, we have a more third sector industry more important. So every time scale merit makes a good answer. So we have to change our mind. And even for this kind of thing, all of people in any area should be happy. This is our story. Well, for a long time, Japan has a kind of policy of balanced development all over the country. So we spend money to all over the areas. But they have no special industry. So money is disappearing. So what happened there? The remote areas, people could not find any good industry. But they are happy to get the money. But nothing more. And finally descending everywhere. So now we have to change our mind. So in this kind of policy, now movement of people come to this kind of access is happening now. And maybe next 30 years, 40 years, half of Japan will be, losing population. But it's okay. We can get more nature. As a total, the country should have a kind of power here in this area. So point here is we have to change our mind. This is our policy about that. Do you understand?
I mean, this is a very, actually, I hadn't quite heard you say this, but this is in principle a very radical proposal. In other words, all those many communities, small towns, that are basically dependent on government subsidies because they don't have a production function. Let's transform that into nature. I'm quoting you now. And let's bring the rest in the superpower corridor. It is a change of mind. Now, I'm engaged in some project in China where the central government their sort of obsession now is, besides Wuhan and all of that, but it's really how to develop spatial formats, not special, but spatial formats that combine rural and urban, a bit the opposite of what you're just very translate. There was another question here. Did you want to ask? Okay, it was already answered. Well, I think we've run out of time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Assaf? Okay, I'll introduce you. Great. So our next speaker is Assaf Biderman, who will talk about moving bits. He's associate director in the Sensible Lab, City Lab of MIT. I've been there many times. Assaf is a technology inventor, author, and entrepreneur. You teach at MIT, and you're the associate director there, right, of the lab. You have a background in physics, design, and computing. Assaf holds multiple patents and has co-authored over 50 publications and book chapters. His work has been exhibited in museums around the world, and so it goes on and on. Absolutely extraordinary record, Assaf. I was talking about you. You see? Yeah.
Who is this person?
Who is this person? Right.
Hi, thanks for having me here. Good. Okay, so do I need to really speak like this, or does it work if I speak like that? Okay, great. So hi everybody. I'm going to talk a little bit about part of the work that we're doing at Sensible City Lab and how it relates to mobility. And I took more of a literal interpretation of mobility, meaning people moving around. I was sort of toying with the idea of taking a less literal interpretation and thinking about, things moving around, information moving around, and really basically including much more. But I decided to really constrain it to the literal interpretation. But most of it is viewed through harvesting different types of information, and that's where I'll dwell a little bit in this talk. So I'm going to skip the cities part and why it's important to study cities. I think we all understand that, and the technology part is quite obvious already. Phones everywhere, we can connect to each other everywhere. You can slap those in your machines and then have the machines connect to you, and you connect to them, and the machines connect to other machines. Whether this prediction will hold or not, this is by Ericsson, 50 billion connected devices in 6 years. Even if it's half of that, it's still, we're talking an order of magnitude more than we have people on this planet, which is interesting. That means that the things around us are going to become somehow equipped with these things, or derivatives of them. They're going to go online, they're going to tweet at us, and we can tweet at them. Some of them can even move and respond. So let's think about this. I mean, you can flip it on its head and really think about the city as if it were an open-air computer and start to program it and play with it. And what's nice about distributed computational systems and programmable systems is that they can be programmed by multiple entities. They're non-centralized. They're very malleable. And it presents itself with dramatic opportunities for changing the city. What we're looking at the Sensible City Lab is how this kind of interweaving of a digital layer with the physical environment is allowing us to understand the city in a new way, to impact it, to make it a better place to live, basically, bottom line. I want to give a couple of examples from stuff we did say 4 or 5 years ago because it relates to this issue of mobility. Let's think of, in the context of us being equipped with technology and the environment being equipped more and more, a lot of information is generated. That exchange constantly generates a trace. Now, whether it's for one purpose or another, you can grab that information and use it to describe space, physical space, and how we use it and what's going on in it. So this is one example from something we did with the mayor of Florence, who's now the prime minister in Italy, to study tourism in the city. So back then we were asking, can we use the fact that people are beginning to geotag their photos? Today there's that metadata on almost every photo we take on our smartphones, in order to describe how people move. So that's Florence, and you can see here the Duomo, Ponte Vecchio, many of the places you might know, and how tourists concentrate. And all we did is just grab pictures that are readily available, free to watch, uploaded by people. We take their GPS tag and we map it to create a heat map. It's very simple. And we started looking at traces, because people's identity, their sort of user account number stays what it is, and you can start to see how they move through the city when they take photos and upload them, and then they take a photo in another place, etc. And you can easily guess, for example, these are two maps of, one is locals exploring Italy, and the other one is tourists from the US. You can guess which one is which, describing the mobility. Now, we went a little bit further with that same concept in Barcelona and all over Spain. We were trying to create a real-time system harvesting photos. And this one, sorry for the low resolution, I don't know what's going on here. Basically, we're taking those photos, harvesting them, and populating a heat map as they occur. And you can start to ask that system questions, because people say what they did when they took those photos. So, for example, you can ask, where are the parties in Barcelona? There are a lot of parties. Here we did a comparison between where are the Brits and where are the parties, and there's a striking correlation. People disclose their country of origin there. Here you can go a little bit more sophisticated and use people's pictures to survey the environment. For example, in Spain there's an issue of drought every year almost, and it enters from east to west when summer begins. You can use LiDAR and all sorts of ways to find that out, which is what they've been doing. And we asked, can we use people's eyes, meaning can we grab their photos to understand how drought spreads itself? By looking for the color green in the photos and how it changes into brown. So that's a very simple kind of image processing that you can do on those images and start to populate a map with the patterns of the spread of drought. So using everybody and the sum of us to sense the environment. Another thing we did in Rome was looking at cell phone data. So here we partnered with Telecom Italia and tried to understand patterns of movements of pedestrians. So we looked at, they had special hardware back then that was triangulating phones. I don't think they have it anymore. You don't really need it with smartphones these days. But they were locating phones, and we were looking at their acceleration. And basically getting, for a matrix of the city, say a square of 250 meters by 250 meters, we would get a number. How many phones are there, and what's their acceleration level. And when you look at acceleration, you can pretty much determine who's a pedestrian, because cars can accelerate in speeds that we cannot. In Rome, you can certainly be faster than a car, but you don't accelerate as fast as a car. And then we put it next to a map of the buses and how they distribute themselves. And the question was, can we identify patterns in how people move around so that you can better match the supply side of transport, and have say, so to say, the buses follow the people rather than vice versa. Here in New York, we're looking at 150 million trips of taxis for a year. These are drop-offs and pickups. And just using some network mathematics, we're trying to dissect this data, basically cluster it into groups of trips and look for symmetry, because it's very obvious that there are a lot of taxis in the city, and while they reduce the number of private vehicles on the road, they're also a toll on the city's infrastructure. But the question is, what can you do to keep the level of service but maybe reduce the number of taxis. So we started looking at the data, and the data is great because it goes from the sort of finest grain to the scale of the city. We know the problem, right, that many times you have taxis congregated in a huge parking lot like you see in the airports, or that you can wait for a taxi and not have one at certain times of day. So there's a level of inefficiency in that system. We started looking for that symmetry, and one quick example is Penn Station versus Grand Central. I think, I don't remember the time period, maybe a week here, I forget, something very short. At 1.7 million trips one way, 1.6 million trips the other way. You don't need to be a rocket scientist to realize that you probably could put a major mode of mass transport in between those two, so that you won't need 3 and something million taxi trips between them. It's an extraordinary amount of taxi trips, so you can start to join trips. It turns out that if you constrain the 50-meter radius on where you get on a taxi and 2 minutes on your pickup and drop-off, kind of as a range you could play with, you could provide the same level of service with 40% less taxis. I hope nobody here is from the taxi union, but and that's only by putting 2 people in one cab. So, we're getting used to sharing physical, immobile things, right? Like Airbnb, and even today, your kitchen, all sorts of things like this. But so, how can we start sharing moving things, things that are in flux? It's an interesting question, but we probably will get there now with how equipped we are technologically and connected over the network. I'm hovering quickly on purpose because I was going to fit this into 15 minutes. I'll leave some time for questions. There's a couple more projects that I'll show. Something quick here that we did in Copenhagen that was recently spun off into a startup. This was a question, a one-liner question, with the mayor there back in the day, Rick Biago. The question was, how can we get more people to cycle? And the reason it was an interesting question for us to ask in Copenhagen is because it's already like a mecca of cycling. 55% of the trips are done by bike, 1.08 bikes per person. It's really extraordinary. If you can do something there to get more people to cycle, you can probably translate it to many other places because they've picked the low-hanging fruits. And that was in preparation for the climate summit in 2009 that they had there, where I think it was the last time when world leaders at the highest level got together to try to re-ratify Kyoto Protocol. So they wanted to send people home with a message. So we started asking, well, why don't people get on bicycles to begin with in that place? And we started looking at other cities as well. And it turned out that distance, as expected, is a major thing, and topography. So 15 kilometers between home and work was a major drop in cycling, which makes sense. It's sort of like your 40-minute affordance for a trip. We see it also when people use other modes of transport, like the bullet and the Maglev train, right? It's the same measures of distance we're willing to take in terms of the time spent every day to move around. Hills are a major thing, so people don't want to get to work drenched in sweat or to have to really work hard after a hard day's work. So these are obvious things, but if you think about it, over the past 100 years, cities stretched because of the automobile as a technology, and now it's going to stay, no matter how green fuels get. So the question is, how can you let people find an alternative, or how can you offer an alternative to people that's not the automobile? The idea, obviously, you want to make maybe the bicycle into a little bit of a car. So we started looking at electric bikes, which is a booming thing in Europe, billions of dollars every year, very expensive, kind of clunky, heavy, but they cost like a car. They cost like 3,000 euros a piece. And we started looking at sensor-enabled bicycles. It's not really there yet either. It was more of a joke. It's a colleague of ours from Dartmouth who did this. But China alone sells 24 million units of electric bicycles every year. But it's a very different case over there, because over there it's people who want a car and can't afford it or are not allowed to use it. So it's a different case. US is growing into this idea of electric bikes very fast. Actually, it's double-digit growth, and I think it's about $150 million worth of electric bikes sold a year, so still very much small. Japan is big. It's like $500 million of those, 400,000 units. Australia is quite big. What we decided to do is, rather than focus on the bike as a whole, we said, well, maybe the bike can be thought of as a commodity if it's really a transport mode. Because there's 3 factories in the world build, I think, 90% of the world's bicycles. We said, let's focus on the propulsion and the intelligence in the system. So we packed everything into the wheel, and the idea was to sell it directly to people, so nobody else banks on the propulsion system, and they can get it in a rather affordable price and slap it on their bike. So it has I'll show it again quickly. This has a motor, which is a generator as well, a set of batteries, a little computer, but a dozen sensors that sample the rider, how he or she pedals with her feet, sequence, cadence, power output, torque, everything, and the environment. What topography are you in? Crossing the two with the amount of energy left in the battery to tell the motor how to push you. Average person puts out about 75 watts. This adds about between 250 to 350, depending on the country. That's legal limitation. So added together, you're like a Tour de France rider with drugs. And you know, that this is sort of what it looks like. The idea is really that it could allow you to stretch your reach. If you want to, and you use it, you just pedal. So there's no buttons or anything. It just keeps the natural experience of cycling. You just can reach farther, you can climb hills easier. But the reason I'm showing this is not so much to talk about how that might change the way we move around in cities. Bikes are not new. Is what people did with this. So we put an Arduino interface inside that wheel. You control it with your phone through Bluetooth, and we're using the phone as a gateway to the cloud. So with that Arduino interface, you can almost start to think of hardware implementation as apps. So imagine people sticking different types of hardware to make apps that do all sorts of things in the wheel. So 12 bike messengers, for example, put nitrogen oxide sensors and collected information in Copenhagen that mapped air quality. Just, you know, the community did it there. And this streamed over to our servers and was grabbed by one of our students and mapped. And you can do these bottom-up real-time maps. You know, that's just one example. And in Copenhagen, it might be benign. If you did it in Beijing, it could be polemic. We just did an experiment with this in Hong Kong and comparing the air quality between Hong Kong and Shenzhen, which is really interesting. It's like almost one city with 2 different lungs. There's a dramatic difference in the particulate matter concentration between the 2 cities. But the interesting thing is that people can start to not only consume information as they move around to inform them, but also produce it for each other. Now, last thing, I think it's the last thing I want to show is a kind of mapping we wanted to do to look at qualitative aspects of moving around. So yes, we can map trips and use that for planning or for navigation. Here we're asking, can we map more than the location of vehicles or people as they move around? Also map emotions to see how frustrated people get when they move around, and create like an index of frustration and use that to understand. Basically, we didn't know what we'll see. We wanted to see how does the frustration index look, for example, for Boston. So here we put galvanic skin response sensors on the steering wheel, and we're measuring basically I think it's the acidity level of your sweat. And we put also camera that measures facial features and Kinect that can map you in 3D. We were also looking at the location and also looking outside the car to see what's happening that might cause that frustration. Is it just traffic? Is it something else that's more personal? Is it an incident? Here's a quick video.
Just finished the drive. It was incredibly stressful. It was the most stressful drive I've ever been on. Nevertheless, I think we have a lot of great content to measure road frustration, because I'm certainly frustrated at this point.
This was together with Audi, coincidentally.
Okay. Stop the car.
So we were just sideswiped, and right now my stress level should be through the roof. We got the information, we'll have to process the data and see where it's really at.
Ground truth level. I'll stop here. Thanks, everybody.
So any questions or comments? Yes, please come to the mic. Since we have little time, just anybody else that wants to use that mic?
Thank you for that very interesting presentation. There's a lot of investment these days in vehicle automation. How can this data get back to people behind the wheel to reduce traffic or affect driving habits? Has there been any work in that? Thank you.
Let me make sure I understood your question. So you're asking how can we use this for self-driving cars or self-driving things?
For people driving cars to reduce traffic.
Well, there's a lot happening in that sense. There was a startup called Waze, bought by Google a few months ago, a year ago maybe more than a year ago, I don't know. What it does is basically you download an app and you agree to get a congestion information in return for your location. So everybody shares their location, and by that their servers create a predictive measure about, I think they can do an hour or two ahead of traffic, so they can give you an ETA and put you through the shortest route. So that's one example.
But then if everybody, of course, chooses the shortest route, who is on the application, you have just moved the problem.
Well, it's an interesting question, right? Because first of all, we don't always follow instructions. Second of exactly. That's one thing is a human question of compliance, and the other one is a question of delay. If that system had no delay, you could always reroute and it would work. But if there is delay, it starts to oscillate. That's a scientific question from the standpoint of how that system could perform.
Okay, so I have another question. If there are no others, please, if there's any other question, go stand at one of the mics, and then. So let me ask you. A lot of the information, I am familiar with some of what Sensor Lab does. I think I was on the board for a while there, or maybe still am. But
you don't show up, but you're on the board.
I know. Thanks for reminding me in public. That's really good. So I know that there are some great applications. You showed other maps, those of Perugia and Florence, etc., where you're tracking people. You can tell they're Americans. You can tell how they. So what do we use that information for? Because of course one immediately thinks of national security and their capabilities. So do you have any? Tell me a bit, or tell us a bit about how can we make that work for people rather than for some, corporation that wants to sell them stuff, or a travel agent, or whatever.
Yeah. So it's a really key question. First of all, mechanically, what we do is we take information, we just basically open it up. So it's not about centralizing it. That's mechanically, but I think the question of use case is probably more important. Let's take an example of a project that you were involved with, what we did with AT&T and showed at the MoMA. There we plugged into their IP backbone, which is like a big pipe that carries out all the internet, mobile, and now landline as well, traffic. And each of those packets that go through this pipe has some sort of a tail that says where it goes and where it comes from. So think about this as a way to, and you could localize them to the level of, say, a neighborhood. So what we did is we created a dissection of demographics in different neighborhoods in New York just by looking at that data. And now for New York, it's important because a major source of population growth here is immigration, especially in the past decade and a half. Now think about Lagos. It becomes much more interesting because they haven't done a census in a long time.
One of the astounding outcomes of that study was that in New York City, there are 2 highly internationalized zones, and the rest of New York is completely sort of parochial in terms of how it uses the telephone. In other words, they call their buddies in the neighborhood, more or less. And one of them is the high-end, Manhattan, United Nations, etc. But the other one is the immigrant communities. Whereas the vast sector that falls outside of those 2, it's extraordinary. At best, it's national calls, but in fact, a lot of it was regional calls, which is sort of an interesting. Now, the question then still remains, what happens with that information? I mean, every time now that we produce information, that question hovers over us, and I think we cannot become totally neurotic about it. We're sufficiently neurotic as we are anyhow, but there is an issue here, that we have to somehow confront. Your question, and then we're done.
Thank you. Well, fantastic presentation. But I have a pointed question about bicycling. Maybe I'm still smothering from a biker who knocked me down last Friday in DC, 3 blocks away from the White House, and not with his bicycle. It was a case of a road rage. I didn't like. My point is, don't you think that it's not just bicycles, but now electric bicycles and gadgeted, if I'm used that name, is not creating more Darwinian interface between the population, in that now you have to watch out to the biker who might be trying to deliver 40 lunches in 10 minutes, because that's what or just like that guy, I think he's a Tex-Mex, he just wanted to show me who ruled not the pedestrian, actually, the pedestrian road. And this is in Washington, D.C., 3 blocks away from Pennsylvania, Avenue 16. I cannot imagine how might it be in China, or I'm really scared because I'm traveling there in 3 weeks.
I think it's a bigger question about the use of technology for moving around, right? I mean, are you scared of walking in the city or driving in the city? Right? We accept a certain level of risk in moving around, and I don't think this one introduces a particularly high risk. Actually, probably lower. If you had many more bikes and many less cars, probably you'd see less injuries. I mean, that's what it shows in cities that are very bike savvy. Yeah, people die, but overall, less than when you have all those bikes replaced by cars. So, no, I don't think it's a risk.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'm happy now to introduce our Diana Barco and Doris Tarchópulos. You're going to speak one after the other, right? Rather than together. Right? Just one presentation. Okay. But I'm going to introduce both. Diana Barco is a Colombian architect who studied actually here and at MIT. She worked with Rogelio Salmona before establishing her practice, which was really about research in low-income housing, design of mausoleums, interventions in historic buildings in Cartagena and Bogota, to Cartagena especially, a very old city. And these projects got multiple awards in international biennales. She also curated a retrospective exhibition which then generated a Latin American prize for architecture that generates and enables public spaces. Presently, she is one of the curators of also an Audi-sponsored Bogota project on mobility and urban fabric. Barco is also an activist and advocate in global arenas for sexual and reproductive health and rights. I will also introduce Doris now, yes? So her colleague, who's also on that same Audi project, is an associate professor and director of the Master in Urban and Regional Planning in the Architecture School of the Javeriana University, and a co-curator of this Urban Interactions and Future Mobility project. Doris is also an architect and the winner of several awards. She worked as an architect in the office of Miralles Tagliabue Architect Associates, with extensive experience in research in urban planning, housing, and urban growth. She's also co-curator of this particular project and is a director of a program in the Architecture School of the Javeriana. Thank you very much. So, Diana, you come.
Good afternoon. I'm trying to connect to this PowerPoint. Whoops. Okay, you get to see my desktop. First, please. I think there we go. Okay. Good afternoon. Thank you, Saskia. We would like to thank Saskia Sassen for this invitation and for giving us the opportunity to share our ideas about mobility and the future of Bogota resulting from the Bogota Urban Interactions research project. This project has been carried out by the School of Architecture of Design at the Javeriana University in partnership with the Audi Urban Future Initiative, of which Saskia spoke at the beginning of the introduction, where they're trying to figure out mobility all over the globe, and this is the first project that has ventured into Latin America. It is a collaborative project curated by Doris and co-directed by Camilo Pinilla, supported by a curatorial committee of architects and planners, including Lorenzo Castro, Alberto Escobar, Rafael Obregón, and myself. It is a work in progress, and the results will be presented in an exhibition and a publication in August of this year in Bogota. Under the broad umbrella of this conference, Mobilities in Cities, from Visible to Invisible, Saskia has invited us to reflect upon mobility in all its expressions and has proposed mobility and the automobile as the variables to be examined. We would like to look at the city as the variable itself, looking beyond post-structuralist logic of systems and circulation. We would like to talk about city form and more specifically its physical attributes, since the city's habitability, and in this case mobility, are conditioned by these. We believe that in its urban patterns, the city has the potential for transformation, to develop spaces for future mobility that can improve the quality of life at different scales. We explored our hypothesis in the design studio during the semester. We looked at historical documents and urban planning proposals to map the patterns of urban growth and analyze the territory and city form, its components, urban fabric and activities at different scales through fieldwork to see how they affect current mobility. We also conducted interviews to better understand the context at the human scale. The Spaniards founded Bogota in 1538 using the colonial grid from which the first street system grew. Because of its isolation, Bogota's growth was very slow compared to other Latin American cities, until the tram, the railroad, the trolley, automobile began to determine its form, size, and expansion, beginning in the 1930s. In the 1960s and 70s, the city grew rapidly. As a result of high birth rates and poverty, as well as lack of opportunities and violence in the countryside, there was intense urban migration, and Bogota doubled its population every 10 years until quite recently. The city needed to address this exponential growth, and in the second half of the 20th century had three unique moments in planning which have left an imprint on the city's urban patterns and on its future. The first of these was Le Corbusier, José Luis Sert's, and Paul Lester Wiener's plan for Bogota of 1950. In his basic scheme, Le Corbusier's plan laid down the foundation for the hierarchical street grid and the sector derived from his 7V theory. Although the Le Corbusier sector was not formally adopted, its proportions and geometry were used to develop and complete new areas of growth for future expansion. The plan also identified the natural landscape linked to the hydrological system, which are protected areas to this day. These were deemed ideal locations for facilities such as schools, childcare, and sports centers. However, Le Corbusier's plan was based on a population estimate of 1.5 million people for the year 2000. That number was reached in 1964. So therefore, in 1969, the mayor, Virgilio Arco, commissioned a new study, Phase 1, directed by Lachlan Curry, to focus on strategies to confront this growth. The plan envisioned so-called environmental areas or sectors, which promoted mixed land use to reduce the dependence on cars and facilitate pedestrian circulation. It also proposed a hierarchical street grid and dedicated bus lanes, as well as a light rail solution for mass transit. Phase 2 of the study, led by Llewellyn Davis and partners, further proposed a polycentric metropolitan model, applying the notion of cities within the city as a way of limiting suburban expansion and as a solution for mobility for this monocentric city. By the year 2000, Bogota had collapsed due to the influx of displaced rural population, uncurbed growth of new developments, and informal expansion in the periphery, resulting in insufficient infrastructure to meet the city's needs. The mayor, Enrique Peñalosa, decreed a new territorial planning and land use act. Until then, Bogota had grown by the addition of small and incomplete fragments as semi-rural land became available. Furthermore, the traditional neighborhood fabric was undermined as gated communities became the norm, turning their backs on streets, and there was an exodus of schools towards the periphery. The plan articulated Bogota's transportation infrastructure, housing, and environmental systems into one coherent idea with corresponding projects, as I suppose a good master plan should. And it included an intermediate scale planning and set the standards for new developments with mixed land uses, such as this integral housing project of Metro Vivienda. Of course, the signature transportation initiative was Transmilenio, or rapid bus transit system, which some of you are familiar with. This inexpensive soft technology solution took into consideration the existing street grid and in the process reorganized the street profile, public space, and landscaping. In addition, ciclorutas, or bicycle routes, bicycle lanes, were laid out along the rivers and parks as well as the main roads. Both of these innovations greatly improved the life and mobility of a majority of the population. At present, the problems confronted by the previous plans persist and have been aggravated. Nearly 7,750,000 people live in the city in an extension of, in the city proper, 40 kilometers in length and an average of 12 kilometers in width. The metropolitan region has a population of over 9 million. Both the distribution and the density of the city, as well as its activities, are not efficient in terms of land use. The greatest density of working in low-income population is, of course, concentrated on the periphery, and the workplaces and services are concentrated in the city center. As such, daily mobility between the periphery and the center overloads the primary street grid since the light rail, tramway, and trolley disappeared in the 1950s. The subway has been proposed but not built, and Bogota does not yet count on an urban cable car for neighborhoods where access is difficult due to steep terrain or beyond the reach of planned infrastructure. So let's see how 9 million people move around the city every day. We have a short video.
Pienso que por los trancones y tanta demora, las calles primordialmente, prácticamente toda Bogotá está destruida.
Lo mejor que le ha pasado a Bogotá ha sido Transmilenio, pero desafortunadamente ya llegó a su tope. Una ciudad de más de 8 millones de habitantes debería tener un sistema de transporte más sofisticado.
No es práctico para nada, es estresante.
It's a very good network for moving around Bogota. It's a little bit incomplete.
La movilidad es muy buena, en especial en el servicio masivo de transporte Transmilenio. Hay una afluencia muy importante.
De cualquier medio va a llegar uno tarde. O sea, lo más fácil es Transmilenio.
Yo procuro levantarme 4:10 de la mañana para ir saliendo 4:40 para iniciar labores a las 6 de la mañana. Digamos, ustedes ven el paradero 4 o 5 buses y salen llenos.
Cuando salgo de clase más o menos a las 7, tardo 1:30 hasta 2 horas porque es muy lleno y la congestión es tenaz. Cojo Transmilenio a esa hora porque en el SITP los trancones no me dejarían llegar.
Levanto súper temprano, me demoro entre 1 hora y 1:30.
Pues el transporte con la cuestión de Transmilenio mejoró, porque esto en los años 60 era una cosa tremenda, era una pesadilla el transporte en Bogotá. Mejoró un poco, pero también tiene muchos problemas, hace mucha falta el metro, creo yo.
Cojo un bus que decía al frente de mi apartamento, me demoró 1:30 casi, pues porque precisamente pasa por la Cali y hay muchísimo trancón.
Antes vivía era en Bosa, a mí me tocó trasladarme de Bosa acá a Suba porque me quedaba más cerca. En Bosa yo me levantaba a las 4:30, llegaba acá a las 7 de la mañana.
Mire cómo va, seteado. Uno viejo como le dio un viejo.
Hora y media más o menos en Transmilenio.
Nosotros normalmente de Madrid a Bogotá nos gastamos 45 minutos. Hay días que son 2 horas.
Bueno, me levanto a las 3:30, tengo que estar a las 6 de la mañana en el trabajo, 2 horas y media, 3 horas, por los trancones.
Que este alimentador demora, yo duro hasta 1 hora esperándolo. Y yo me he hecho casi 2 horas, 2 horas y media hasta que no paro.
Son 2 horas y media por la mañana y 2 horas y media por la noche.
Total, durante el día yo me gasto 3 o 4 horas sentadas en un bus.
The state needs to take more responsibility about the condition of the roads because the traffic is made worse because people are having to slow down because of potholes. The traffic can't flow freely.
Falta por lo menos contar con un sistema de transporte masivo adicional que no sea basado solamente en Transmilenio. El CIP, que pues como yo lo veo, ha sido un fracaso en el sentido de que la gente lo desconoce completamente.
Los CIP andan vacíos, gastando gasolina de un lado para el otro.
Vacío y no para ya, otro vacío.
No me sirve el CIP porque no va para ningún lado donde yo trabajo. Transmilenio es demasiado costoso e incómodo
Prefiero coger el bus normal, yo por economía y por comodidad.
Salgo a trabajar a las 8 de la mañana. Me estoy gastando 20 minutos o 25 de acuerdo al tráfico, que para mí la ciclorruta 1A.
Esta es una alternativa fantástica, haces deporte, te diviertes y vas mucho más rápido que los carros.
Yo manejo bicitaxi hace más o menos 6 años. A las 4:30 de la mañana, culmino a las 9 de la noche. Hay más o menos ahorita 10.000 bicitaxis.
Eso ya lleva más de 25 años este transporte acá, por esta zona. Por la mañana bajan 2, 3 carros seguiditos y después eso no se vuelve a ver un carro por ahí en 20 minutos, media hora. Mientras nosotros hacemos 3, 4 recorridos, estas busetas no han bajado. El sistema integrado no llega donde estos carros llegan. A nosotros nos llaman transporte informal. O sea, informal sería que nosotros obligáramos a la gente a que se subiera y nos pagaran. Ellos se suben porque no encuentran otra forma de transportarse hasta donde van a ir. Salgo a las 10 de la noche y estoy llegando acá por ahí a las 11, 11:30, y entonces esto es lo único que me sirve porque igual los buses no suben hasta acá. Entonces si no fuera por eso me tocaría pues no estudiar.
In spite of these testimonies, according to official data, the factors for good mobility in Bogota are considered ideal. First, car ownership is amongst the lowest in Latin America. And secondly, 70% of the people still are already taking public transportation. In Bogota, the ratio of cars to people is 1 to 7.7. While in the US, it's 10 cars per 7.7 people. Of course, this is rapidly changing as the desire for cars is very high and the incomes are growing. So in terms of public transportation, Bogota counts on taxis and traditional non-integrated and rather chaotic private bus service that transports more than 2 million people a day, a circuit of 400 kilometers of bicycle routes, where almost 500,000 bicycle trips take place every day. And of course, Transmilenio, which transports 1.8 million people per day. However, only a third of Transmilenio has been built, which explains why it's gone from being the panacea to sort of the culprit, because so many people depend on this one system. So, within this context, we asked ourselves, what are the physical attributes of Bogota for a new mobility? And there.
So, within this context, we ask ourselves, like Diana said, what are the physical attributes for Bogota for a new mobility? This is to say, disregarding technology, transportation policies, and restrictions, connectivity, cars and bicycle sharing solutions, as well as other aspects that has been discussed in this conference. How can we generate the spaces for a new mobility? In our study, we looked at the territory at different scales to decipher what changes are needed to improve mobility for the year 2050, when the city will have an estimated 17 million inhabitants. One strategy is to plan more self-sufficient sectors to reduce the need for displacement. Another is to revitalize and use the existing underlying spaces and structure. Some of these spaces are in use and simply need to be completed or reinforced. Others are waiting for recycle. For this, we have derived 4 planning principles which are fundamental and key to transforming the city. In the first place, we must rescue the landscape and the geography. One of the main features of Bogota are its green areas and water. Most of the streams that flow down the mountainside have been channeled, and not buried, leaving margin for public space and allowing their recovery. Integrated park systems can provide new spaces for bicycle lines and pedestrian circulation, as well as low-impact mass transportation systems in tandem with other activities and services. Along this green spine of the mountains, cable car can connect the extremes of the city as well as areas with difficult access along the skirt of the mountain. In the second place, we must rescue the forgotten mobility footprint. The existing railway corridors can provide an opportunity to revitalize and densify sectors. They intersect and cross, and transportation lanes for short to medium distance travel. Within this boundary, different technologies can be superimposed without disturbing the existing fabric of the city. At the local level, multimodal hubs can integrate the corridor with the existing road grid and bicycle lanes, while on a metropolitan scale, the mixed-use corridor can link multiple city centers, activities, and facilities. On a regional scale, this corridor can reconnect the surrounding municipalities and potentially even the abandoned railway system across the entire country. Thirdly, we must rescue the existing street grid. Bogota has a robust underlying hierarchical street grid resulting from earlier plans. The system must be completed to connect and integrate the city. The different street sections and profiles must be treated accordingly. Larger, faster streets can acquire a more human scale through landscaping, public space, and mixed modes of transportation, while the intermediate street can be reutilized with soft mobility solutions to create internal circuits and integrate neighborhoods. At the local level, this can become controlled access street. Finally, we must rescue the local scale. We would like to reinforce the notion of the sector and the intermediate scale resulting from the natural street hierarchy. Bogota should have multiple district centers, greater density, and rational land use to curtail urban sprawl and improve mobility. We propose converting these existing sectors into self-sufficient mixed-use areas where the needs of everyday life at a local scale are within walking distance and where a sense of community can grow. We have selected one of the key studies to illustrate how these 4 principles can be applied to improve mobility. This area at the northern periphery is incomplete and disconnected. It includes informal settlements on the hills, houses and residential towers in gated community, a cluster of school campuses, the Torca River, a piece of existing railroad system, and a very heterogeneous population. This grid is discontinuous as circulation is very difficult. In this particular case, we introduce a cable car in the mountains, along the mountainside, and the linear park to connect the mountains with the river and its wetland here. We recover the rail system and use the corridor to develop commerce and service on the ground floor. This is the corridor. To increase the activity and the density. We broke open the gated community to complete the street grid to create continuity in the urban fabric. We also create a bicycle routes and smaller urban units where circulation is limited. With this strategy, we propose that Bogota develop a vital space for future mobility from its existing urban patterns. Our proposal rests on the premise that the spaces for mobility transcend their original function. What is fundamental is the urban grid, not the devices. By creating multiple districts and city centers, the urban fabric is consolidated and the need for extended travel is reduced. It is apparently simple, but it's hard to implement. Underlying our discourse is the need for political will and governance. We are trying to reclaim the role of urban planning in favor of the public good within the framework of equity. There must be a long-term vision and continuity in the design and implementation of master plans independent of the administration on power. Urban planning can achieve consensus around opportunities that guide the participation of private initiative in the construction of the city through collaboration with the civil society and win-win situation. For the above, there must be institutional capacity and a sense of common good over individual interest. We believe this approach is fundamental, sensitive to existing fabric and the human scale, as well as being inclusive, democratic, and sustainable. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Questions? Adam, yes?
Yeah, really briefly, I was very struck by that picture. Beautiful work, thank you. I was struck by the picture of the rail yard or the right-of-way that had gone green. Did I understand you correctly to imply that the entire national rail network has been abandoned? And if so, when was that and why?
Yes, the answer to your question is yes. Almost all of the railway lines have been abandoned. There's one in the north, right, the one northern corridor. And in Bogota, they lie green like that. Some of them have had informal settlements grow along them. But basically, that's a true picture. And what's amazing is that in that lot, there are, we didn't show that picture because we thought it was a little bit cheesy, but there's a locomotive, a 1920s locomotive, which actually goes out on Sundays and on weekdays as a tourist train. And there's some engineers that are working to try and revitalize those motors.
Why?
Thank you. Why?
Why was it abandoned?
Oh, why was it abandoned? Why was it abandoned?
Oh yes, because the private companies of transport along the whole country make a lot of pressure to be the one, the trucks, the one, the principal way to move the merchandises and people around the country.
That sounds like a familiar story. You know, that happens in other countries too. Like this one.
Thanks.
It's one of the reasons. There's a narrow gauge railroad. Colombia is a narrow gauge railroad system. And it's not adaptable to modern railroad technology. Modern railroad technology implies changing the whole track. The cost of changing that track is immense. Really, the truck issue is secondary. The big issue was the track.
Yeah, John.
Okay, thanks. Thanks for a really interesting paper that in a way sort of put into context all the things that various other presentations had sort of rather airily pontificated about and recommended and so on. And you kind of confronted the sheer difficulties and problems in a place which has been interestingly innovative. And so I thought it was very interesting. But it seemed to me that there was another issue that sort of needs further thought, and that is that you very much emphasized about mobility without much reference to the kind of activities that people would be engaging in and the complex ways in which those activities will be spatially distributed. So I've seen and participated a little bit in some work in Santiago, where the sheer complexity of people's lives as they were kind of moving around, I guess, a somewhat similar city, and trying to assemble a sort of pattern of activities during the day, over the week, was immensely complex. And I thought there's another set of issues, debates and processes to document on top of what you've already said.
That was a comment, right?
Well,
oh,
yeah.
Yeah, no, because it was a very good comment.
Thank you. My name is Daniel Latore, and I consult with and have worked with Project for Public Spaces, and then also just consulting on my own now on doing civic participation. Actually, I just came 2 days ago from Cali. There's a project, Corredor Verde de Cali, which is a 15-kilometer disused rail line right down the center of the entire city. And what we're doing, we've been brought on board through funding from the Ford Foundation to make recommendations as sort of international assessment to work with the local colectivos urbanos and the city, Findeter, and all the other partners that are involved in it. The one thing that I'm struck with from thinking about this, in Cali, the mayor's ending his term in 2 years and isn't up for re-election. He's sort of like a Sergio Ferraro, a little bit, sort of, and so Cali is kind of where Medellin was 10 years ago, perhaps, parecido. But regardless, you see what happened in Bogota with the removal of the mayor. So the political instability, you could say, or fragility maybe is a better word. In addition to, in Cali, there's 4 families that control a lot of the way the city works, and it's similar in Medellin and in Bogota también, as well. So the only thing that I'm left with, and this is where the question is I'm actually, I was brought on board to think about technology or different mixing online and offline methods of civic engagement. And that is well and good, and there's lots of best practices for that. But the thing that I'm now struggling with is I feel the need is for the citizens to have a sense of ownership on a block by block level along the entire corridor. And I'm now wondering about the role of community-based journalism, how to maintain interest, the stories, the transparency about that. And have you encountered any comunos or colectivos that have been doing that well in any of the work that you guys have been looking at?
I think Doris can answer that because you've worked in housing, let's say in the housing initiative with the community a lot. No? But in terms of these reclaiming these corridors, this is really a very preliminary piece, and we thank you for the suggestion in terms of going more deeply into how do you structure those multimodal districts, and how do you actually encourage activities to concentrate and so that you can release the pressure. But maybe the housing sector has had a lot of experience of community activism.
Well, the community is essential in this kind of studies. In fact, the interviews that you saw in the video, it's from the people who live in the peripheral areas in that kind of communities. So this is a preliminary study, as Diana said, but obviously the community is a very, very principal for our study.
Perhaps one response would be to say that when there was just recently, about 2 or 3 weeks ago, there were riots because Transmilenio, although being a big promise, only I think 113 kilometers have been built of 380 that were projected. I'm not very good with figures, which is why I rounded them up. So the solution, because the stations haven't been completed, the extension hasn't been completed, etc., the response of the community was to demand that the Transmilenio be open at 4 in the morning. I mean, that's not a solution, but that was the pressure, and that was what was actually achieved because people wanted to be able to get on, even if it's at 4 in the morning. You saw that people wake up incredibly early and waste so much time on public transportation.
Thank you very much. I propose, it will fail, but no matter, I propose a 5-minute break, okay? Now my clock might be wrong, says it's 4:20, so can we start the next panel just a little before 4:30? Thank you.